change the security situation of the region. To implement this project, from my point of view, both countries has to take some measures, or they have some homeworks. Can you count some of that homeworks? And second question would be that do you see any link between the China involvement in Taliban reconciliation process and this corridor? Thank you.
I have written on the topic of the link between trade complementarity and conflict resolution, and I think it's a very poor idea to use economic corridors or economic development of this type, projects, massive projects, as a source to try to resolve conflicts that are ongoing. The conflicts that are in the region are so severe that no amount of economic interaction, especially with their manufacturers, if they are being manufactured in this specific state, is likely to succeed. First, you have to resolve the security situation. Then you can start talking about potential sharing of costs and all the things, and the cohesiveness of the networks and all these things. When you look at the more successful examples of that, that's what happens. Essentially, you have a conflict-free area where there's no concerns whatsoever over the duration of the project, of the construction of the project, about security concerns. As long as there's one minor security concern, then the whole project tends to there's a backlog of concerns that takes place following that. So I think it is a great idea. I'm very hopeful for the world, but I don't think that this is really the right time to start a economic corridor of this type, despite the potential promises that are being voiced. Once you have resolved the conflicts, multiple conflicts, and more that could emerge as a result of this type of activity, then you can start talking about building a network of this type.
Well, so I generally agree with Lawrence that in general there's not a very robust relationship between trade complementarity and conflict resolution worldwide. I think that this is a very specific case, though, that is quite different for the following reasons. China is doing this not particularly for the reasons that people usually do this. And I'm sure we're going to discuss this a lot more later on. China is both trying to limit India's growth as a regional hegemon, and as well as establishing trading partners that are specifically proximate to it in terms of its borders. This is one of the reasons why I think the China-Africa comparison, I mean, we will have to see, but I'm a little bit more skeptical about that. I do think that China's involvement, it's not a mixed message. China is very clear about what it wants, and it doesn't have mixed messages about what it wants the Pakistani government to do. I think that possibly has the opportunity of aligning Pakistani security interests towards that orientation in a way that there have been a lot of mixed messages from within the Pakistani military and security elite before then. And one of the things, and I think this is going to, Christine might have different views on this, but one of the things that we're seeing is that the military itself is changing its orientations. Raheel Sharif visited Fatah without the ISI. There's been a terrible attack on Peshawar just this morning, in which the army came in and very, very seriously just interdicted the terrorists in the university. It was a terrible situation, but the military, I think, is increasingly, and security elite, and again, Christine might have a different view on this, but are orienting towards stability. Now, that doesn't resolve these deeper questions about inequity, structural inequalities, and especially vertical inequalities, especially in Balochistan, but increasingly as the link goes north to Pashtun populations in Fatah and the northwest frontier. So that, I think, is a different set of problems that I agree are very, very problematic. But the way that China is doing this is, I think, creating a direction that Pakistan could potentially just follow, which would lead to greater stability and security at least.
Time for one more question now, and I'll take it from over there.
Asmat Kafir from the School of Economics. My question is this: do you think that this project will sustain without the support of the Baloch and Pashtun population in Pakistan? Because the state is continuously marginalizing these two communities, and there are insurgencies in Balochistan and Fata and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Will this project, without their support, sustain? Because their concerns are not addressed, so there will be more insurgencies and violence.
I encourage as brief a response as possible to such a complex question.
I think this is a very, very serious problem, and I will just say this, that the government and related civil society actors have a choice. And the choice is to come up with some kinds of political settlements with leaders in these populations to address some of the inequalities, or to treat them as they have treated them before, as internal colonization. And I really don't know which one they're choosing. I mean, I'm not optimistic, but there is a possibility for the Pakistani state to rebuild some potentially durable state-society relations that could minimize the disruption that the economic corridor could create.
Thank you very much. I've seen lots of hands going up. I think I've noted you all. When we come to the major discussion at the end, I'll give you priority in the questions on my place. It's time for our next speaker now, Dr. Christine Fair, Associate Professor, Security Studies Programme at Georgetown University. Among her many roles, she was political officer of the United Nations Assistance Mission into Afghanistan in Kabul. Research military affairs in South Asia. She's authored and co-authored several books. I know you've got an intriguing title today. China, strategic competitiveness, partner in security in South Asia, question mark.
Yeah, so actually I'm not going to be controversial, because I first of all, I don't think CPEC is really going to happen in its most capacious form. And anything that does happen, I think the energy is going to be the first thing. I agree with you. Pakistan needs that for all the reasons that have already been stated. So to any degree that CPEC actually happens, we actually all benefit. I think, I'm going to represent sort of an American view on this, and I think the problem from the U.S., and then India has complementary concerns, is that when we see China, for example, in the East, we see China as a strategic competitor. And the problem comes down to the way our combatant commands are organized in the United States. So the Pacific Command, which oversees China, will generally see China as a foe, on the negative side, as a strategic competitor, to be euphemistic. Because PACOM does not have vision into the Afghanistan and Pakistan theater, they actually cannot see the positive benefits that China actually brings to this region. But so it's actually kind of interesting. When you go to CENTCOM, Central Command, which oversees Afghanistan and Pakistan, they are hoping China is going to bail us out. When you go to PACOM, they only see the negative effects of a rise in China. Since I am a South Asianist, and I don't have to worry about what China does in terms of building islands and sticking airstrips on them, I don't have to care about that part of China. Where I come from, I look at the situation in Afghanistan is really quite severe. Everyone focuses upon the troop drawdown, and I am screaming, that's not the drawdown you should be caring about. The drawdown you should be caring about is the economic drawdown. We have built the largest rentier state that's ever existed in Afghanistan's history, and it can't pay for the slightest of its recurring costs. I want China to come in and build that railroad. Afghanistan has a lot of resources in the ground. It only becomes viable when those resources are taken to a market. And to going to Adnan's point, I don't see China as doing this because it's magnificent. I see China actually has this really, I think it's the only country that does this incredibly long-term investment horizon. It will take really brutal short-term costs if it sees, and by the way, their planning horizon, I think, is 50 years plus. An American time horizon, you're lucky if you get these bozos to think for 6 months because of the election cycle, right? I mean, this is a very big issue in our budgeting. So I'm like, China, please come in and build this railroad. And this, I often get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it. China actually brings its own personnel largely to these projects. So we can have a big debate about, I mean, for example, when I've traveled through Tajikistan, I saw Chinese doing the actual road construction. When you talk to Pakistanis, the Chinese live in colonies. One fellow I spoke to was complaining they even bring their own food in. So that we can have a real discussion about what is their contribution to the local economy. But what we can say is that Pakistan and Afghanistan needs this infrastructure. And if you look at the way China deals with labor policy at home, there's no nice way of putting this. If people die in the course of a project, people die. And they're not, if 100 people die in a mining accident in Virginia, there's congressional hearings about this. But this is sort of routine business in China. So China, if you look at the costs, the human costs that they've been willing to endure in Pakistan, no other country would do this. So in terms of a national investor that's going to be willing to put its personnel literally in harm's way for these projects, there's no other country that's going to do it except China. So I'm actually very bullish that something in this, though in its most capacious form, extremely unlikely, that to any degree that CPEC happens, it's going to be good for the region. Now, no one's actually talked about what CPEC is. And so there's, as Lawrence said, I'm not sure that there's a definitive document, but if you look at, for example, some of the Chinese journals that talk about it, I mean, you actually have these very different corridors. And from China's point of view, the goal is the rest of Xinjiang province, they're trying to, just like they've done with Tibet, is to economically integrate it to the rest of the country. And so these corridors that link Urumqi, and I'm sure I just butchered that. I can speak Urdu, Hindi, and Punjabi, but I don't know how you pronounce these names in China, that link Urumqi elsewhere into China. And then you have the corridor that we're mostly focusing upon, which links Kashgar, right, going all the way down north-south, basically, and then hitting over to Gwadar. So a lot of that infrastructure is there in some modest form. The things that really vex the Indians, sorry, that happened ages ago. I don't know why you're grousing about it now. And what they can actually do is leverage already some of the motorway projects that are either the motorways that currently exist or that are ongoing. So if you think about this as salami slicing, it actually doesn't look as crazy as perhaps it does when you look at a map. Perhaps the most controversial GLOC, or ground line of control, is going to be that which is planned to connect Peshawar with Gwadar. And, again, you ask yourself, what consortium of lunatics is going to invest in this? Well, the Chinese. They're the only ones that would even consider such a crazy thing for the reasons that Adnan noted. So I'm actually very bullish. The region needs this. And everyone else is basically taking their paychecks home, basically taking our checkbook. So if it's not China, then no one's going to do it. So let's talk about, so we've got China's strategic interest in integrating Xinjiang with the rest of the country, but also with other regional neighbors, and obviously integrating Pakistan. Then CPEC is also supposed to give China access to Afghanistan. So we have this ring road, which right now mostly the Taliban use. It would be great if other folks were using it. And it's largely seen, at least in the Indian discourse, as a competitor to the North-South corridor that India was allegedly helping the Iranians to construct, beginning in Chabahar, and then linking it through Delaram, into the ring road with Afghanistan, and then through road and rail up north through Iran, and then outward to the rest of Europe, Russia, and other Central Asian states. But the reality is, India has actually been playing along with the Americans in terms of respecting the sanctions on Iran. And whereas a number of years ago, Iran and India were trying very hard to get Chabahar going, and in fact, nothing has happened. And if a colleague of mine recently came from Chabahar, she said the Chinese are all over Chabahar. So, and basically the Iranians are saying to the Indians, we prefer you, but we will take the Chinese. So what China's been actually very adept at doing, while everyone else has been sanctioning Iran, has been actually going in. In fact, when I studied in Iran, I studied Persian in Tehran, I had several Chinese and Korean students in my class. So it gave you a sense of where the Chinese were investing. So in some sense, the Chinese are already diversifying. Now, by the way, Gwadar is already there. Another point, everyone's all, well, what if the Chinese get access to Gwadar? They've had access to Gwadar. There's nothing new here. The fact is no one wants to use Gwadar, right? Because the way in which the G-locks connect Gwadar. Why would you use Gwadar when you have other more convenient routes available? So I don't really understand the vexation over the Gwadar issue. So we sort of think about the pluses and the minuses and what I'm going to call the neutral category. On the positive side, China's really motivated to deal with its internal security. By integrating Pakistan in this way, I see Pakistan as largely the net beneficiary of this. There are real issues on who's going to be the beneficiary in terms of long-term profit generation. If it is, as we've seen, China is going to remit those profits. So, for example, the power plants, China is going to remit the profits from, that's basically the deal, right? We build these plants, you can't build these plants, and we're going to remit the profits home. So, over the long term, China benefits financially, but Pakistan also benefits from having these amenities. There's very real questions about who is going to be employed. And since we don't exactly know where all of these G-locks are going to go, there's obviously going to be net losers and going to be net winners. Adnan's point about Balochistan and Fatah is absolutely critical. And I share his dubiety that there's going to be a way of resolving this. So when I talked to Baloch separatists, I said, you really have two choices. You can either face extinction, because the army will extinguish you. I don't know if y'all are paying attention to what the army's doing in Balochistan. It's very hard because they don't let anyone cover it. Unfortunately, I believe my weapons are being used to exterminate Baloch. So you have two choices: extermination, or you get on this bandwagon and you try to negotiate for a fraction of the rents. And I tell them, I think extermination is a kind of a sucky alternative. And those are just the realities. I mean, the Pakistan army will eliminate the Baloch, who are in any event a very small percentage of the population. They've been very adept at making the Baloch look as if they're Indian tools. They are not Islamists. The Pakistanis don't care. There might be some exceptions if this thing is just dealt with. They will eliminate the last Baloch to make, and it's not Baloch, my American friends, I call it Balochistan. They will eliminate the last Baloch to make Balochistan safe for Chinese exploitation, because doing so advances the service of the states. So in terms of the positive benefits, I see a lot of security benefits potentially accruing to the Chinese. But then again, they've had these benefits already. When a Uyghur gets caught doing something nefarious in Pakistan, the Chinese say to the army chief, would like to see this dude wrapped up. And he mysteriously is wrapped up, usually in a coffin. So they already have that benefit, but this allows the Chinese to exert even more leverage on Pakistan. So let's talk about security. There's two dimensions of security. One is internal and one is external. What Pakistan's experiencing, obviously Balochistan is ethno-nationalist, has a very different origin from the other disputes, but what Pakistan is currently experiencing is blowback from its strategic objectives of using terrorism as a tool of foreign policy. There would be no Pakistan Taliban if there had been no Afghan Taliban, had there been no Jaish-e-Mohammed. I could go on at length about this topic. So Pakistan is very serious about eliminating those parts of the Pakistan Taliban that it cannot reconcile. Those that it cannot reconcile, it will kill brutally. However, ladies and gentlemen, they are very good at reconciling parts of the Pakistan Taliban to go back to good terrorists. Good terrorists are those that operate in Afghanistan to kill our troops and our Afghan allies, or rehabilitating Jaish-e-Mohammed to kill Indians. Right? So this has been their strategy. So Pakistan will increase its domestic security at the cost of external security. CPEC in its most capacious form may incentivize the Pakistani state to take seriously its own internal security, but it will have the negative externality of, basically these guys are like a water balloon, right? Until the Pakistani state decides that terrorism, under its nuclear umbrella, also known as nuclear blackmail, is not an effective tool of statecraft, this is going to be a dynamic that is going to persist. Nothing in CPEC can change the ideological nature of the Pakistan army. So we can't. So I'm very bullish that there's going to be, in a limited way, domestically, a number of benefits that's going to accrue from CPEC, but there's going to be negative externalities. And actually, this is where China becomes a very interesting actor. It's the biggest investor in Afghanistan. For Afghanistan to present all of the profits that China could maximally accrue, there has to be stability in Pakistan, right? Because for it to have maximum value, for example, from Gwadar, it has to be linked up to the ring road. So what China has to do is actually decide what's more important. Is it Afghanistan or is it going to be Pakistan? And this is where China's role, I think, again, because China doesn't see this from democratization. There's no ideology here. This is money and it's security. And I, being someone who worked with many economists over many years, I trust calculus based upon money and security more than I do ideology. So this is going to be, for me, the question of how does Afghanistan negotiate these trade-offs, that security in Afghanistan will have negative impacts upon Pakistan, security in Pakistan will necessarily be at the cost of security in Afghanistan. And I think those are kind of that's the bullet points.
Excellent.
Oh, one other point, though. I want to pick up on what Adnan said about the nature of the economics of the Pakistani state. Pakistan is also a rentier state. It trades on its insecurity. It basically says to the international community, keep paying me before I shoot myself. No one has said goli mardo and make the problem go away. This doesn't change the fundamental inability of the Pakistani elites to for example, expand the revenue, basically the tax collection net. This doesn't change Pakistan's fundamental nature as a rentier state, which is absolutely essential if Pakistan is going to truly have a democratization process. What it's simply doing is shifting the balance of who's primarily writing those bills. As an American, I say, China, it's your turn.
Thank you very much indeed. A very robust performance. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed. And now it's Dr. Samir Puri's turn. He's a lecturer in international relations here at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And 6 years working at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, including a spell for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in eastern Ukraine. So welcome for contributions even more explicitly on terrorism, security and counter-terrorism dimensions of Sino-Pakistan relations.
Great, well thank you for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to follow Christine. We worked together 7 or 8 years ago at a certain US think tank on the subject of Pakistan negotiating with a gun against its own head to extract as much money as it possibly could from a very desperate US government that had effectively backed itself into a cul-de-sac in which feeding the beast was really the only way it could actually get from one day to the next. Now I have to admit, as you picked up from the introduction, I've been out of studying Asia for about a year because I've actually been in East Ukraine, which has obviously got nothing to do with this subject, except for the fact that to get myself in the mindset just over a year ago, for my year in Ukraine, I did something I've always wanted to do, which is I took the Trans-Siberian Railway, and I took it on the route down from St. Petersburg through Mongolia into China. And I say that because I have a very clear image in my head of the topography, albeit of Mongolia, which borders Xinjiang, as being quite utterly desolate. I mean, you would look out the window and nothing would go past for half an hour, 40 minutes. You're traveling pretty fast here. The lesson I took from that in terms of looking at this particular subject is a question for the audience to think about. To what extent is Xinjiang to China what Baluchistan is to Pakistan, respective to those two states? Both, as Adnan, I think, pointed out, or certainly with regards to Baluchistan, relatively underpopulated for the size of what they are, relatively unintegrated into the metropolis, relatively distant from the dominant ethnic groups, the Han Chinese, Punjabis, however you want to describe where power lies in these two respective countries. And therefore, these countries have arrived at a position in which they need and want to integrate those parts, those resource-rich parts of their wider expanse into sort of the benefits of advancement and modernization. And keeping in mind that parallel, I want to talk specifically about the security threats, which many of you have brought up in your questions, as of course being one of the main obstacles to realizing this ambition, this very grand ambition of trying to integrate and extract resource. There is, of course, no direct similarity between the causes being fought for, but there are echoes of why fighting has taken place and continues to take place on both sides of the sovereign border. There is a persistent feeling of disenfranchised, disengaged, disempowered people who feel like they are the losers from economic advancement. There is a big difference in this region between the separatist and the Islamist jihadist instinct. Now, I say there's a big difference. That doesn't mean to say they don't overlap. And I think the most tenacious security threats that countries in this region face are those that overlap. When the Islamist jihadists with a more global ideology actually are able to latch onto separatist causes and bring the two together. I think in terms of the root of CPEC, the Pashtun areas, the northwest frontier province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there, with the Taliban insurgency, there is an equal dose of Islamist, jihadist and separatist anger. It's that fusion. Now, with the Baluch, I want to strongly agree, by the way, with the predilection of the Pakistani state of eliminating the Baluch Liberation Army and all the other different groups. About 6 years ago, when Musharraf was still in exile here in the UK, I went to a talk. It's a public talk, so what he said is on record. Somebody in the audience said, "Mr. Musharraf, when you were president, Bukti was killed, a very important tribal leader in the BLA. Did you order the killing?" Now, Musharraf is always trustworthy for one thing, which is fantastic theatre. He's a very good actor. And he was able to deliver his lines perfectly, which was he was able to say, well, from Rawalpindi, from Army HQ, we don't have daily oversight over the conduct of operations. There may have been a local initiative that took the decision. Even I was convinced. And the fact of the matter is, the Pakistanis don't have a tolerance for separatism. Of course they don't. And they're able to get away with it much more so than they are with the Islamist jihadist armed groups that they face. Partly because of the tactics that these groups use, partly because of the scale of the threat, partly because of the ability to forge linkages. So, back to the CPEC route. The worsening of the security threats for both China and Pakistan is, of course, a fusion between the separatists. It's cooperation between otherwise disparate groups. Most people who work in counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency talk about disaggregating different groups, different factions. Aggregation is a potential trend in terms of the nature of militancy in this region because of the common cause of trying to face down increasing state penetration into these fairly autonomous regions.